Hello everyone, Nick Jacobson, continuing on our series about active shooter. As mentioned before, we have to dive into the history of response before we can go to where we need to be and the changes that need to be made, primarily in the school systems and starting with the school systems, for how do we respond to acts of extreme violence. With that being said, this is going to be a very brief history conversation. There are volumes that can be said about the history of our response, but we're going to go straight to the meat and potatoes of it. At a later date and time, I may come back and nitpick certain key events. With that, as a reminder, you can see there's no fanfare, no fireworks. This is very basic video. My goal was to get this out as quickly as possible with what resources and tools I had available. So please bear with me. And I know you're going to hate the fact it's going to be a little bit of PowerPoint, but this is really meant to be a visual aid for the conversations that I should be having. And that's what the goal of all of this is, starting the conversation towards change. Speaking of history, here's a photo of me when I was working for a school district, speaking to one of our middle schools, teaching these kids what to do in an active threat event. I point this out because of two things. One, a reminder of what I said in one of the last videos. I've had students as young as 3 to 4 years old and students as old as their 80s. Every group of people, depending on their background, whether it's public schools, law enforcement, and age difference, every single person needs to be talked to a little bit differently. This conversation that I'm having with all you is intended for more of an adult audience. There is nothing in it that's going to be profound or provocative or truly frightening, but the level of conversation is probably above your average student, even your middle school students. So viewer discretion advised, parental discretion advised. If you want your child to see this, that is your choice. But I do recommend you take into consideration the audience before sharing this. All right, let's dive right into the history of active shooter response. So no one knows exactly when active shooter response in schools began. But we do know about the 1950s, 1960s era, primarily around Los Angeles, we started seeing actions being done by individual schools in response to drive-by shootings and street-level crimes. So there was a lot of gang-related activity happening in the Los Angeles area, a lot of shootings near and around schools, but we weren't quite seeing the same level of attacks on the schools themselves. Tended to be more targeted shootings. Now, you see I keep saying Los Angeles, California. Now, at the same time period, there's actually more reported shootings at schools in New York than there was in California, but California tends to get the credit because of the term lockdown, which so many of us have heard, whether it was in the news or at your school, whatever it is. That term lockdown came out of the California prison system in 1973 and was very soon after adopted by public institutions in the area who were trying to describe, well, what exactly are we doing during these events? And what did they do? Well, this is their response. The moment that there was a threat, let's just say it was shots fired, they would shut off their lights, close their blinds, lock their doors, and either get down underneath their desks or go to the far end of their classroom. Now, for anyone who's been in the public school system in the last 20 plus years, you'll know that that's exactly what you're probably still doing today. Maybe slight variations from that, but that's pretty much what you're doing. Shut off your lights, close your blinds, lock your doors, get down low. Did that response make sense for their environment? And this, by the way, actually came out of a response to an atomic threat, duck and cover. You notice here they are, ducking down underneath. Did it make sense for an atomic threat? It actually did. Many people say, oh, well, I mean, if you're blown up by an atomic or even later nuclear bomb, what good would this do? Well, not everyone's going to actually be in the blast radius itself. You could be just outside of it, and the shock wave coming through is what your risk is. Windows blowing out, glass flying across the room, potential risk of building collapse. Now, apply this to the actual threat that they had for 1950s, 1960s Los Angeles schools or New York schools. They were facing debris coming their way in the form of lead bullets. And And these individuals were on the streets outside of the buildings. And if there was a drive-by, it was just a random shooting across the buildings, or it was an unintentional round coming that way. It was meant to be targeted at somebody else. Did that make sense? Yes, it did, because of the way that their buildings were structured at the time. They had what we called open breezeways. Here's a photo of an open breezeway school. You can see you have classroom doors, and everyone's happy here. You have classroom doors all leading to the outside. In most of these schools, this lower portion, actually the majority of the wall, was made up of brick, cement, or concrete. Now, some of you might still be going into schools that are still this age. You would have these brick outer walls. Will brick stop your average typical firearm round? Yes, it will. But the windows won't. So by shutting off the lights, closing the blinds, they minimize the ability for somebody on the outside to be able to identify and target somebody on the inside. Locking the doors, they prevented anyone from entering. And by getting down low, below that brick wall, they had a piece of cover, a piece of material, a barrier that would stop bullets coming their direction. And that was their safest place. It made sense for their environment. It made sense for their threat. But threats have evolved and changed, and so has their environment. This is a photo taken, actually you can find this in Google searches. That's where I got this one. And it's of one of the high schools within the school district I worked at. If you notice, the buildings are drastically changed. You no longer have these dark, dingy hallways lined with lockers, although many of those schools still exist. You have lots of windows. In fact, in this particular school, the walls are lined with windows. They don't have real walls, they just have windows. It's beautiful, and I think it's great for an educational environment. From a security standpoint, there's some argument why that's not the best. But even in their locations, they're able to apply the concepts that we're going to be covering in order to safeguard their lives and to make decisions in chaos. Fast forward, Columbine High School shooting. Now, prior to Columbine, the majority of schools in this entire period had no response to threats. Limited schools did in California, but no school really had a thought or reason to. Enter in Columbine High School. What did the school students do in that situation? Well, first let's start with their notification. To notify the event and to initiate the event, the two shooters pulled the fire alarm in hopes of drawing everyone out of the school into a fatal funnel kill zone that they had set up at the entrance to the school. Fortunately for the majority of people involved, they didn't respond as it was expected. They had never had a fire drill during an odd hour. In fact, they had it almost every single time at the same time of day. And it was always during a class period, a specific class period. They never did one during a lunch period. So everyone who's sitting there at lunch thinking, we're not supposed to have a fire drill. But what did they do when these individuals entered? Many of them just hid underneath their desks. Some of them tried to escape. A few tried getting out of windows. The fact is that nobody talked about what to do, and no one thought about it. But this event started the questions within public schools across the nation saying, what do we do now? Enter in schools from California. They said, hey, well, we do a thing called a lockdown. This is what we do. And what were they doing? Shutting off lights, closing blinds, locking doors, and getting underneath their desks or going to the far end of their classrooms. Now we have a nation. We're in 2007, the Virginia Tech school shooting. Now we've had an entire generation of kids who have grown up practicing those types of lockdown drills. Enter into Virginia Tech. What happened during Virginia Tech? Well, the individual entered into a building and began going door to door into classrooms, killing the students there. Now, what was the student response? They got down underneath their desks and tried to hide. Because that's what we've been teaching them this whole time. Go and hide. So let's take a look at this from the aerial view. We're going to bring back that game board, the Follow Me Infantry's game board, as our mock classroom. You have your teacher and your students, and you have your gunman. He was entering into the classroom, engaging targets and students. Now imagine all these people getting down underneath their desks and hiding. Are you really hiding from them under your desks? No, that makes no sense. You're not being protected by doing that. So we were doing, though, exactly what we had been taught to do. hide. This event developed into a video called Shots Fired When Lightning Strikes. This was the early days of what became later on the federal government's Run, Hide, Fight program. You started to see similar language to Run, Hide, Fight. The biggest thing is that they looked at these events and they said, you know what? We can't just tell people to hide. We need to give an options-based approach. 2012, there's a Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting. We all remember the details of this. Again, there's much that can be unpacked from it. There's so many things that have happened that we can talk about. But what we're going to talk about today was the fact that at the same time, the first Run, Hide, Fight videos as commissioned by the Department of Homeland Security, and this one came out of Houston's Emergency Preparedness, I believe. Yeah, Ready Houston. This video was in development before Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting happened. But within a month after the school shooting, they were given the energy to, hey, we got to hurry up and do this because now we have a nation who's terrified and we got to give them something. And you know, there is value to understand run, hide, fight, but running isn't running when you're dealing with an armed threat, when you're dealing with bullets flying. You can't just run. And if you run, where are you running to? Hide? Hide and hope is what we've been doing this entire time. So why would we hide? And fight? Let's talk about that fight. We'll come back to the fight actually in a different video. Fight is not what you think of when it comes to a fight. It's not punches, kicks, knees, elbows. When you're dealing with an armed gunman, you have to deal with the threat first, and that threat is the firearm at that time. So this came out of a document in 2010. So you see it jumps to 2015. You'll see why in a minute. The rationale for the existing active shooter protocols is obvious. Once the school is in lockdown, hide and hope defense actions minimize the chances of being a target, maximize police latitude in clearing the building. The entire time that this has been taught and the way it's being taught currently today is primarily by law enforcement individuals. And why not? We assume that they are experts in our response and what we should do. Now, my law enforcement brothers and sisters, take this with a grain of salt. You are not the expert in the individual's response. You're an expert in your own response, and your response is pivotal to ending these events and bringing justice. But you're not the expert in their response. And it's so important to know the difference. Your teachings have gone all this time to tell people, hey, go hide, stay out of my way, I want to eliminate the threat. And that makes sense from your perspective. But when seconds count, police are minutes away. And when police are minutes away, this comes out of that 2015 document, key research findings, 60% of these incidences ended before police arrived. Now this is dated. Now we're talking almost a decade ago. This number has not changed much. Response time has not changed much. That's just the reality. It takes time from the point the event begins to the point of even the first phone call going out to the first officers being able to show up to the scene. Now, I want to talk about one more event for our timeline in our history. Also to really illustrate this point that when seconds count, police are minutes away. This is Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, famously known as the Parkland School shooting event. I just took this off of Google Images. Thing you need to understand is that the shooting began roughly at 2:21 p.m. Now, what was their notification that a shooting was happening? Well, it was a fire alarm. Jump all the way back to the Columbine High School shooting. What was their notification? Notification was the fire alarm, where they deliberately pulled the fire alarm. In this case, the shooter didn't actually deliberately pull the fire alarm. The concussion of the rounds themselves tripped the fire system and resulted in activation of the fire alarm. Now, these students had earlier that day already done a fire drill. They're already primed and ready for what they do. And what do you do during a fire drill? You hear the activation of the fire alarm, you get up, you immediately start evacuating the building. You go out to the safe distance where you guys have to set up and you get a head count before you go back into the building. Or if it's not safe to go back in, you then wait to get released. That's what they're primed to do. So, in the same building that the shooting is taking place, most of those students didn't even hear that shooting was going on. Gunshots don't always sound like gunshots, especially in a confined environment. Perfect example. President Trump there's a soundbite, may or may not be real, but of him speaking with, it appears to be Robert F. Kennedy Jr. following his event, and he made a comment saying, "It sounded like the loudest mosquito buzzing past my ear." Gunshots don't always sound like gunshots. So an individual is going floor by floor, actively engaged in killing. People are evacuating with the fire alarm. That started about 2:22 is when the alarm was activated. 2:21 is when the first shots were begun. It still wasn't until 2:24:54 when the announcement of Code Red came out across the intercom. And by the way, I'm going to do a quick pause. If you're in a school district using code terms for things like this, Code Red, you got to go away from that. That use simple, plain talk. If there is a shooter, someone's actively engaged in shooting, say it. There is a shooter. There's a person with a gun. We've got to go away from this code talk. Schools have for long feared that we're going to trigger or frighten kids by using terms like lockdown, lockout, shooter. There is appropriate ways of doing them in drills and training, which we'll talk about at a later time. But when it comes to the emergency, get away from these codes and don't ever use them in your drills. So it's still, though, 2:21 to almost 2:25, 4 minutes, people were evacuating this building while a shooting's occurring. And once they were notified that there was a code red, many of them turned right around, went right back into the building. Why? Because they're supposed to lock down. Does that make sense? No. But what have they been trained to do for years? They have been trained to hide and hope. All right, in our next episode, we're going to start jumping away from this and moving towards the making assessments in chaos. This is the beginning of your response. Again, there's so much more that can be talked about the history, and at a later time, I might go back and nitpick some of these events a little bit more. So stay tuned. We're going to start talking about making assessments in chaos.